All right, without any further ado, let's get started. Continuing our top 25 players in the NBA list with number 15, Devin Booker. So in this regular season, he averaged 27, 5, and 5 on 58% true shooting. That's excellent. In this postseason run, he averaged 23, 5, and 4 on 59% true shooting, so a 4-point drop in his scoring. One thing I'll say in his defense there is he had a hamstring injury. Any one of you guys out there who's had a hamstring injury before, I had one shortly before I started playing in college, and I re-injured it 2 additional times before I finally got it healed. But any of you guys who've had this injury know it specifically hurts you with explosiveness. You could play a lazy brand of basketball and your hamstring will do okay if it's somewhat far along in its recovery. But as soon as you start really trying to explode and take long steps, that's where it really tests that hamstring. And that's a very important thing to have as a scorer in the NBA. So him having his hamstring, compromised, even if it was just partially, I would cut him some slack, especially after how good he looked in the playoff run in 2021. His final 5 games versus Dallas, which they lost 4 of, he averaged 22, 5, and 4 on 42% field goals. He had 20 assists with 24 turnovers. So a pretty ugly end to the Dallas series. Hard to look entirely past, especially because of his shot profile, which we'll get a little bit further into here in a little bit, involving his pull-up jump shooting. But I would like to cut him some slack over that hamstring injury. He's as well-rounded of a 3-level scorer as we have in the league. Now, when I use that phrase a lot, 3-level scorer, but there's a difference between the 3-level scorer in name and the 3-level scorer in practice. It's kind of like when I'm talking about shooting. You're either a shooter or a maker. Anybody can be a shooter. You're just taking shots. But a maker is someone who can consistently make them, right? Well, it's the same thing with the 3-level scoring thing. There are guys who have the ability to 3-level score, but it doesn't actually manifest in balanced scoring. There are 3-level scorers out there that rely too much on their jump shot. Paul George used to be like this, although he's gotten better, as we'll talk about when we get to him later on in the list. But you actually need to, in practice, have balance in your offense to make yourself difficult to guard. If you're good at shooting threes, good at scoring in the mid-range, good at scoring in the short range, and good at scoring around the rim, but you don't actually try to get to the rim, then players will start to sit up on your jump shot and you'll have issues. When you start to really dive into Devin Booker's numbers, there's remarkable balance. So check this out. In the regular season, he averaged 2 restricted area makes per game at 68%, which is really good for a scoring guard like him. 2 additional paint field goals per game outside of the restricted area at 46%. That's really good. 3 mid-range jump shots per game at 47%. That's outstanding. And then 3 3-pointers made per game at 38%. So he's scoring twice in the restricted area, twice in the short range, 3 times in the mid-range, and 3 times from the 3-point line per game. That's outstanding balance. He's 39% on corner threes, 38% on above the break threes. Doesn't really have a weak spot on the floor. He's comfortable scoring from absolutely anywhere. That's the appeal with Devin Booker, and that's what allowed him to have such a dominant playoff run like he had in 2021. Now, the one thing that can get a little tricky with Devin Booker is he does rely heavily on pull-up jump shooting. A good percentage of those shots, regardless of where they are on the floor, involve him getting to a spot and elevating over the top of a defender to knock down shots, even in the short to mid-range. You've probably seen it before, but Devin Booker will work you down to 7 or 8 feet, pump fake, and then rise up over the top and take a jump shot. A good percentage of his offense comes from pull-up jump shooting. The tricky thing with that is, even on your best day, you're going to miss some pull-up jump shots, right? Like, any one of you guys out there who has any sort of pull-up jump shooting in your game, even if you're good at it, even if you work extremely hard, you're going to miss more than half of them. And what that means is you're going to have hot streaks where where you can go 7 out of 10 or make a bunch in a row, but then you're also going to have cold streaks. In Game 6 and Game 7 versus Dallas, he was 3 for 16 on pull-up jump shots. And when that failed him, he didn't have a backup option to go to. When you rely on pull-up jump shooting and the pull-up jump shot fails you, unless you're a great playmaker or you can live at the rim, you're not going to have a backup punch to go to. And Devin Booker has some balance to score at the rim, but he is not a guy who can live at the rim. And he's an okay playmaker, but he is not a good playmaker. And so that's why I've always prioritized as scorers, bigger wings, like the bigger, stronger rim pressuring wings, because when their jump shot starts to fail them, they can at least put their head down and go to the rim and have some impact collapsing the defense. And then that's where the playmakers in particular can bring great value. That's the story of LeBron James's career. When he's making his jump shot, there's absolutely nothing you can do with him. He's the best player in the world. But even when he's missing his jump shot, he's going to go 8 for 22, which is solid. He's going to score 28 points. He's going to get to the foul line 8 times, and he's going to have 11 assists. Like that's the dynamic of the big rim pressuring forward that's so interesting, is they have the ability to impact the game in so many different ways beyond that of a pull-up jump shooter. Devin Booker, to his credit, has turned himself into a pretty solid on-ball defender. He's scrappy, he's physical, he uses his hands well. He's kind of a disruptive defender. He's only okay in help side defense. That's a little area of opportunity for him. And then just like every other guard in the league, he's susceptible to bigger wings in mismatch situations. You saw that a lot against Dallas. Luka punishing him under the basket for layups and ones and things along those lines. So the question here is, can Devin Booker be the best player on a championship team? I don't think so. I think he's a number 2. I don't think that's a hot take. I think most of you would probably agree. I think you either need to be a great playmaker or be a much, much bigger, stronger rim protector in order to be a top tier, the best player on a championship team as a scorer in the NBA. That's where I'm going to lean more towards the Kawhis and the Jason Tatums and the Kevin Durants of the world as big scoring wings than the smaller guys like Devin Booker, who basically have the same type of shot profile as those guys, without the physicality to get easier shots around the rim and without the playmaking ability to make up for their lack of size. All right, number 14, Damian Lillard. Now, Dame is a top 10 player when he's healthy, but obviously he's dropping here because of health concerns. He's been saying things about how his abdominal muscles has kind of healed itself. He shared some pretty crazy stories about having a big lump that he would see like in his stomach after games and stuff. That's freaky. Hopefully that's healed. Hopefully he'll be back on the horse. Now, the 2 previous seasons combined, he averaged 29 points, 4 rebounds, 8 assists on 63% true shooting. That is ridiculously good. 40% on 10 3-point attempts per game. In the postseason, he averaged 34 and 8 on 65% true shooting. He's also arguably the best pull-up jump shooter in the game of basketball. Over the course of those 2 seasons, he averaged over 10 pull-up jumpers per game and shot 40% on them. Now, there's a huge difference between pull-up shooting and spot-up shooting. I wanted to break this down because we're going to get into it a little bit deeper with Paul George. And I've actually been directly working on this with one of the college players that I've been working out with over the course of this summer, who's going from an off-ball role into an on-ball role this season. And so we're working on changing the shooting mechanics into the feel of shooting off the dribble versus shooting in spot-up situations. And it's super interesting to me because in spot-up shooting, it's very mechanical. You want muscle memory, you want as few moving parts as possible, and you want it to be as replicable as possible, because at that point it's you're standing still waiting for the basketball, and when the basketball comes to you, you want to be able to unleash something that is a muscle memory thing that you've done thousands and thousands of times that is more reliable. Pull-up shooting is completely different. There's a fluidity to it as opposed to a mechanical feel to it. The reason why is the ball is always in a different spot depending on what your footwork is and what your dribble combination is. In a spot-up shooting situation, you might catch it wherever you catch it, you're bringing it to your shooting pocket, and then you're starting your routine, right? But in an off-the-dribble situation, I might be doing a behind-the-back dribble to my left hand and have the ball out here and have to flow right up into a shot, or if I have it out here, flow right up into a shot from the right side. It's a completely different type of feel. You can't be mechanical in pull-up shooting, because if you take time to get set into your shot after every single dribble combination, you're never going to have enough time to get the shot off. And so what impresses me the most about Damian Lillard and Paul George, who we're going to get into here in a little bit, is they have remarkable fluidity into their pull-up jump shooting. Dame's go-to move in pull-up jump shooting situations is he kind of lulls you to sleep with the dribble in his right hand, and he does a hard pound dribble with his right hand and steps back to his right, kicks his right foot out to help square up in midair, and he knocks it down. I always am a nerd when it comes to the little details of skill development, just because I personally, my archetype was always a scorer, so I'm always looking to add little like scoring moves and things to my game. And Dame's pound dribble step back to the right is one that I think every scorer should have in their game, and I've always been very, very impressed by the fluidity in his jump shooting ability. Dame is every bit as good as Steph on the ball. The numbers are unassailable. Last 2 playoff runs, 30 points per game on 65% true shooting, 8 assists per game. A knockdown pull-up jump shooter. He's every bit as good as Steph on the ball. But why is he usually hovering around the 10th best player in the league while Steph is in the conversation for the best player in the league? Well, that's the best example of the differences between focusing on the aesthetically appealing things in basketball and the things that actually impact winning. You guys probably remember the Mike James quote that came out the other day saying that Steph was one-dimensional. Couple of different interesting things there. One, that's the best example I can give you that playing the game of basketball has nothing to do with your understanding of the game. Mike James is a very successful basketball player who has played in the NBA before. If you think Steph is one-dimensional, you do not understand what you are seeing, okay? That's why I give a great deal of respect to the people out there who have not played the game, but that have taken the time to try to learn the game. So because it's a lot easier said than done, and it does take a lot of work to understand what you're seeing on the basketball court. But even in that specific case, Steph is an excellent scorer, and we just talked about that with Dame on the same level as Steph, and Steph demonstrated that in this playoff run, particularly in the NBA Finals against Boston's drop coverage, just routinely barbecuing them for going underneath screening actions and things along those lines. But Steph has always been massively underrated with his winning characteristics, the little things he does to impact winning. And that's not just his leadership, even though he's one of the best leaders in the game of basketball. It's not just his mentality and his competitive nature and any of those things, even though that's as good as you'll find in the game of basketball. It's actual on-the-court work. First of all, Steph is considerably bigger than Dame. He's 6'3" and pretty well built. He's also very committed to the defensive end of the floor. That has turned Steph into an above-average defensive guard in this league. Dame is in the bottom tier of defensive guards in the league. He's a good athlete, but he's pretty undersized. He's much smaller than Steph. That makes it tougher for him to hold his own in positional defensive situations. Guys can go through and around him pretty easily. And then lastly, the moving without the basketball. Steph Curry is the best off-ball guard in the league, and Dame Lillard seems pretty uninterested in doing that. Moving without the basketball is super important for a bunch of different reasons. First of all, it helps create quality shots for yourself. Pull-up jump shooting, like we talked about earlier, is hard. The shot profile is hard. It's not reliable. Sometimes they'll go in, sometimes they won't. So you need to supplement your offense with easy looks. For bigger rim pressuring forwards, that's living at the rim. That's putting your head down and going through people to try to get layups. For a guy like Steph, he does it by moving without the basketball. He's going to get himself 3 or 4 wide open threes a game just by constantly staying in motion and capitalizing on defenders having brief lapses in attention. And when they had those brief lapses in attention, he sparks open for a second, Draymond or someone else hits him, he knocks down a 3. That's how you supplement the more difficult areas of your offensive attack with easy shots. And then secondly, it's the decoy effect. We've all seen this with Steph a million times, but he'll come running off a screen, and the guy who's setting the screen, his man will go out with Steph, and then Steph's man will go out with Steph. And then all of a sudden, whoever's setting the screen, maybe it's Kevon Looney or Draymond Green or somebody, they just flash to the basket, they're wide open for a dunk. That decoy, the decoy attention that Steph draws moving without the basketball creates shots for his teammates, and then he also creates open shots for himself to help supplement his offense. Dame Lillard has everything he needs to do that. He's such a deadly shooter that if he embraced that off-ball movement, he would generate himself easier shots throughout the game, and he would get his teammates open looks. But for whatever reason, he's been pretty uninterested in doing that. And so that's the biggest area of opportunity for Dame, and I'm not sure if he'll ever take advantage of that, but if he does, I don't think he could ever be in the same conversation as Steph because of his defensive limitations, but he could get up into that 6th or 7th best player in the league if he started doing those things. You've seen what Steph is capable of offensively. He's arguably, I I would say he is the best offensive engine in basketball right now. Dame could be a nearly as impactful offensive engine if he embraced those winning things that Steph does without the basketball. So what can the Blazers accomplish this year? They're actually putting together, they actually have put together a pretty interesting roster. I really, really like the Jeremy Grant trade. I think he's a perfect number 2 to have alongside Dame. He had a rough year last year because of injuries, but the previous year he demonstrated that he can be a relatively efficient volume scorer. So you put him alongside Dame, Jeremy Grant and Dame. Anthony Simons has blossomed into a pretty decent scoring guard in the NBA. So you've got 3 pretty good scoring options. Jeremy Grant is a capable defensive player, and they added some really important role players over the course of the last couple of years. The Josh Hart acquisition, I really appreciated. I think that's going to help them a lot. Josh Hart is a solid 3-and-D wing in this league. And Gary Payton II. This is a player that I wanted the Warriors to keep. I was really disappointed in them for letting him go. I pointed out the numbers to you guys, but the difference between the way the Warriors played in this postseason run with Gary Payton on the floor versus Gary Payton off the floor was jarring. He's an impact playoff player in the NBA right now, a perfect guy to put alongside Dame on the wing or in the backcourt to help him with all of the dirty work responsibilities on the floor. And then Yusuf Nurkic is a fine role player center in this league. Shaedon Sharpe, he ended up getting hurt, I believe. He had like a shoulder injury or something along those lines in Summer League, but he's a really intriguing young player. Very high ceiling, low floor type of guy. He could be like a more athletic version of Devin Booker as a guy who creates shots off the dribble, who has a ton of fluidity with the basketball and is a fantastic athlete. But there's also a version of his story where he becomes Kevin Porter Jr. So it's because maybe he just doesn't pick up on the maturity necessary to become a winning basketball player. So it's an interesting prospect there to kind of potentially extend their window if he pans out into a decent player. What does that make them? If Dame can recapture what he was before he was hurt, and Jeremy Grant's the player from 2 years ago, and Anthony Simons is the type of scorer that he was this last year, and if Gary Payton and Josh Hart stay healthy on the wing and they do their job defending, they're absolutely in the mix as a middle-tier playoff team in the West. I wouldn't put them near the Clippers or the Warriors, but they're absolutely in that tier with like Denver and maybe the Lakers if they make a decent trade this offseason. That's how much I respect Dame Lillard and what he can do with the basketball. All right, number 13, Ja Morant. This regular season, 27, 6, and 7 on 58% true shooting. This playoff run, 27, 8, and 10 on 55% true shooting. He shot 34% from 3 in the regular season and in the playoffs, and he went up in volume a little bit in the playoffs. That's good and bad. It's good in the sense that his stroke translates to the playoffs in terms of his confidence. Like it's not like his shot fell apart when he got to the playoffs. The bad there is 34% is not good enough. So he will eventually need to get that up to about 37, 38% to get teams to really respect him and guard him more intentionally out there. I told you guys about how I thought a really interesting element of Ja Morant's potential development is the fact that he's impossible to officiate because he's so skinny and he goes flying through the lane and can fall down a lot and the refs just don't know what to do. I compared him to Dwayne Wade in that respect. Now, it didn't materialize in a finals run the way it did for a championship run, the way it did for Dwayne Wade, but he did go up to 10 free throw attempts per game in the postseason. That's an excellent sign of replicable, dependable offense for the Grizzlies in later attempts to make deeper runs into the playoffs. He's just impossible to contain with a live dribble at the top of the key. If he gets a live dribble and the floor is spaced and he's working against any defender in the league, he's getting into the paint, he's getting dribble penetration, he's going to make something happen. Couple that with his athleticism and the way he flies through the lane, he's going to draw a ton of fouls. He's your classic hyper-athletic slashing guard, right in the mold of Derrick Rose and John Wall and Russell Westbrook. Obviously, there's little differences between those guys and Ja. Like Wall and Westbrook were more big and strong. Rose was skinnier, kind of like Ja. Ja, I think, is the best passer out of any of them, except for maybe Westbrook, although I can be critical of Westbrook's passing sometimes because I think it's a little reactionary. It's a little bit like a reactive, as the people in the comments tried to tell me last show. He's a little bit of like he'll pass when he has to kind of guy. I find Ja Morant to be a little bit more willing of a passer, and so with his ability to collapse the defense by getting into the paint, that can be really impactful. And then his rim finishing. His rim finishing is outstanding. He was finishing 5.3 layups in the restricted area per game in the regular season, and that only dropped to 4.3 in the playoffs. Now, in the playoffs, typically the teams scout more and they pack the paint more. That's why you're going to see that little bit of a drop-off, but that's not much of a drop-off. He was getting into the basket. Now, his percentages dropped. He shot 67% in the restricted area in the regular season. That dropped to 52% in the postseason, but that's offset a bit by the free throws. Like a lot of those drives are ending in him getting fouled and going to the foul line in that specific free throw, in that specific postseason. So 52%, you'd like to see that a little higher, but him getting to the line, him making 4.3 layups per game and getting to the line 10 times per game, there's no way I can twist that into anything but a massive positive for him as one of the most dynamic rim attackers that we have in the league. Now, this is a crazy stat. So in the clutch, in this postseason run, per 36 minutes, so if I took just his clutch minutes and extrapolated them out to what he would typically play in a game, so 36 minutes, his per 36 minutes in the clutch this year in the postseason were 55 points, 13 rebounds, and 7 assists. So his production in his clutch minutes mimics that of a player who in a 36-minute game would average 55 points per game and 13 rebounds and 7 assists. In clutch situations in this postseason, he shot 52% from the field and 50% from three. That's ridiculous. So that's another huge thing if you're a Memphis Grizzlies fan to cling to. Ja looks like a comfortable and confident clutch basketball player in the NBA playoffs. But the big negative with Ja, and this is something he's going to eventually have to figure out, he's a little too skinny right now. That's going to be a big part. And then a commitment from him in terms of his the way he allocates his resources and his energy. He's just flat out bad defensive player right now. He's bad at the point of attack. He's bad in help. He has some highlight shot blocks from time to time, but he's not like a voluminous shot blocker. In this playoff series against Minnesota this year, Patrick Beverley was straight up looking him in the eye and dog walking him down to the rim and scoring. He couldn't do anything to contain Patrick Beverley. That's a problem. Patrick Beverley's a below average offensive guard in this league. So he's absolutely going to have to figure out that defensive piece to reach his ultimate ceiling. So I compared him to Derrick Rose, Russell Westbrook, and John Wall. I think he has the potential to be better than any of those guys. He already has better shooting form, which I think will translate to him being a knockdown three-point shooter later on in his career. And he's better in the short range than any of them, stopping short and getting to little floaters and push shots in the lane. He's already better than any of those guys were, especially at his age, at that specific skill right now. He's a better passer than Rose and Wall were. I think he will be a better passer than Russ in the long run. If he can figure out the defensive piece and get his jump shot to where I believe it can get, he has the potential to win multiple MVPs and be a better player than any of those guys were at any of their peaks. Number 12. This one's going to be a little controversial for some of you guys, but I've always valued this player particularly. Brandon Ingram. So, in this regular season, he averaged 23, 6, and 6 on 55% true shooting. Somewhat underwhelming, right? But his breakout came in this postseason run. There are a handful of breakout players in this postseason run. Anthony Edwards, Jaylen Brown, Ja Morant, obviously, in his first postseason run, their second postseason run. But Brandon Ingram was magnificent in this playoff run. 27, 6, and 6 on 58% true shooting against the third-ranked defense in the NBA, and his primary defender finished second in Defensive Player of the Year voting. That's Mikal Bridges. This was his coming out party. Really, really versatile scoring. He averaged 2.5 made restricted area field goals per game at 83%. That's unbelievably good. He averaged 3.7 made mid-range shots per game at 50%. That's unbelievably good. And then the thing that stood out to me the most, and you guys will remember me talking about this during the first round when we were doing our post-game shows, he flashed high-end playmaking. We have a lot of wings in this league, guys like Paul George, guys like Kawhi Leonard, guys like Kevin Durant, guys like Jason Tatum, that can pass, but they're clearly like reactive passers that are just making reads, right? Just the basic reads that come from the way that defenses collapse on them. Brandon Ingram is flashing higher level playmaking than even that. Now, what makes it interesting to me is his age. Like, I've seen Kevin Durant in the late stage of his career start to flash this higher level playmaking. But for Brandon Ingram at his age to start to show this is super impressive. And again, it's like Luka Doncic, LeBron James-esque high pick and roll reads. He's getting that ball screen. He's working it down to the elbow. He's being patient. He's putting the defender in jail on his backside. He's waiting to bait the rim protector into stepping up and waiting for the weak side corner guy to step in to help against the lob threat. And he's throwing like a big looping cross court pass that hits the shooter in the pocket in the weak side corner. These are high level reads from the best playmakers in the league that I was seeing from Brandon Ingram in that playoff series against the Suns. That's what excites me the most. To be that good around the rim, 2.5 makes at 83%. To be a knockdown mid-range jump shooter, 3.7 made shots at 50%. And to be flashing that type of high-level playmaking, that's top-tier superstar stuff. And he's not a top-tier superstar yet. He has to be consistent in that regard. But that's why I have him all the way up here at number 12. He showed something in that playoff run that demonstrated to me that he's poised to take a big leap this season, and I believe he will. He was an impact defensive player against the Suns in that playoff series, albeit as a weakness, he's a little bit inconsistent on the defensive end. Ever since he left the Lakers in 2019, he had a great defensive season, and he kind of let go of the rope there for a little while, but he flashed that potential again against the Suns, so that'll be a huge thing for him, his defensive consistency. The one other weakness that I wanted to point out, he was 32% on above the break threes in both the regular season and the playoffs. He's a knockdown three-point shooter from the corner, and he's a knockdown mid-range shooter, but he struggles above the break. Who does that remind you of? Mr. DeMar DeRozan. And if you watch them, they both have similar jump shot form in the sense that they shoot high above their head and they catapult forward. It's lower arc. Now, lower arc actually is less of an issue the closer you are to the basket because you have more margin for error in there. But when you get further away from the rim, you need more arc on the basketball. That's going to be something that Brandon's going to have to figure out because, as we pointed out with DeMar DeRozan earlier, that inability to score from the above the break as a three-point shooter, particularly off the dribble, will really hurt your ability to get downhill. I don't want Brandon Ingram to become the next DeMar DeRozan. I want him to show more of that Paul George fluidity scoring from the three-point line above the break. So getting that above the break three-point shot figured out and getting more consistent defensively, showing what he did in that postseason run consistently for 82 games. That's the difference between where he is and getting into the top 10. Also, his rim finishing, he shot extremely well in that playoff series, 83%, but he was only 67% in the regular season. And as you guys know, when it comes to guys 6'8" and above, big rim attacking forwards, I like to see that number higher than 70%. But he's a little thin, so that's going to hurt him a little bit, but I'd like to see him getting a little bit better at finishing around the rim. So I'm super high on Brandon Ingram, obviously. This is why I thought the Pelicans should trade Zion Williamson for Kevin Durant. I'm worried about Zion's health. I'm worried about Zion's ability to eventually become an impact defensive player. I'm worried about how long it'll be before he can really, really, really help them on a championship level. And they've got such a good roster around that with CJ McCollum and with Herb Jones and with Trey Murphy. I love the way that roster is put together. So I like the idea of pairing Brandon Ingram with Kevin Durant. And you can do that by trading Zion and getting Kevin Durant back. It's a super interesting potential dynamic there with the two of them. I'm not sure how it would work with salary filler if they'd have to include CJ or something along those lines, but I'm super high on Brandon Ingram. The idea of pairing him with Kevin Durant and two really good 3-and-D players sounds like a championship level roster to me. But it seems to me like if the Pelicans make the deal, they'd include Brandon, which I think would be a mistake, but it is what it is. All right, number 11, our last player that did not make the top 10. Paul George. 24, 7, and 6 on 54% true shooting this regular season. In his defense, it was completely injury-riddled. He only played 31 games. But in the 2021 playoffs, so the playoff series before this season, he averaged 27, 10, and 5 on 58% true shooting, which is excellent. He had a bad playoff reputation leading into that playoff run. I think he had lost 5 consecutive playoff series going into that playoff run, if I remember correctly. Or going into the 2020 bubble when they made it to the second round to lose to Denver. They had lost 5 consecutive playoff series. So call that 6 out of his previous 7 playoff series he had lost. He had struggled in a lot of those situations. He got locked up by Joe Ingles in a series against the Utah Jazz. It was all bad. And he had a bad reputation. And in one playoff run, he demonstrated that he was no longer that guy. He demonstrated that he was capable of being that best guy on a championship team level player when he took the Clippers within 2 wins of the NBA Finals without Kawhi Leonard. I thought the big change for him that allowed him to change that perception of himself was making a concerted effort to get to the rim. He averaged 1.8 made shots in the restricted area in the 2020 season. He averaged 2.9 in 2021. That's literally 150% of what he did the previous season. That's a significant increase. Why does that matter? Because do you guys remember when I was talking about the give and take with Pascal Siakam and with James Harden? The need to have a threat to counter your primary strength so that players can't sit on your primary strength? We're going to talk about it in a minute. Paul George is one of the best pull-up jump shooters that I've seen. And he's as fluid as it gets at getting to his jump shot off the dribble. So if players are not scared of him going to the basket, they can press up into his jump shot more. That makes it harder for him to get separation. It makes it harder for him to knock down shots. Him making that concerted effort in 2021 to get to the rim completely changed the type of basketball player that he was and turned him from an inconsistent, unreliable playoff player into a dominant playoff basketball player. 2.9 made shots in the restricted area per game in the playoffs is outstanding. And so that move concept, adding the threat of consistently going to the rim, transformed Paul George. Now, like I talked about earlier, that fluidity in the handle and jump shooting compared to spot-up shooting, I think the best guy to replicate in this specific skill is Paul George. Like I told you guys, obviously I'm not an NBA player, but the player that I think I play closest to when I'm playing pickup is Paul George, and that specific concept of fluidity into his jump shot is what I try to build in my game. The advantage of being able to pull up out of any footwork and any dribble combination is it makes it so that you can be reactive as an offensive player. Because when you hit a dribble combination, you don't know where the defender is going to buckle. So for instance, if I do in and out, through the legs to the left and behind my back to the right, he might lunge at the in and out, he might lunge at the cross, he might lunge at the behind the back. I'm not sure. But wherever he is, I need to be able to transfer energy from that specific spot to either advance the basketball or to go up into a jump shot. That's where that fluidity comes in. I need to always be a threat at any point in time with the basketball to either advance to the basket or to go up into a jump shot. And Paul George, I think, is one of the best in the league at this, particularly at the wing position. And that fluidity just makes him so much fun to watch. His dribble combination jumpers, I could watch a highlight film of that with Paul George all day long. He's a deeply impactful defensive wing. I'll never forget watching him in Oklahoma City just completely lock down James Harden at the peak of his powers. Like, it just a joy to watch him defensively. He's somewhat limited as a playmaker, but like we talked about earlier, almost every scoring wing in the league is like that. We just talked about Brandon Ingram showing flashes of being kind of better and Kevin Durant being better in the late portion of his career. But just for most big scoring wings, it's just not something that's a strength for them. He's a damn good basketball player, and him being outside of the top 10 is everything you need to know about how talented the league is right now. So the big question, is this the year the Clippers can win the title? So you got Kawhi Leonard, Reggie Jackson, and Paul George. Excellent trio there at the top of the roster as offensive creators. And then they have as deep a repertoire of 3-and-D wings that you'll find in the league. Robert Covington, Norman Powell, Nick Batum, Terrence Mann, Marcus Morris, Luke Kennard. And then Zubac, I really like as a center in this league. So they can play big and play drop coverage with Zubac, or they can go 5 out, classic Ty Lue basketball, switch everything and mismatch attack on the other end of the floor. They have one of my favorite roster constructions in the league. It captures my specific basketball philosophy that I believe in so much. I've said it before, but I think the Clippers are the biggest threat in the Western Conference to beat the Warriors, and I absolutely view them as a top-tier contender. And Ty Lue, as I mentioned earlier, is one of my favorite young coaches in the league. I think he's got a very modern approach, very uniquely equipped to handle modern basketball, and his roster is perfectly catered to the way he likes to coach the game. I'm very, very high on the Clippers, and Paul George is as good a number 11 that you'll find in NBA history. All right, guys, that is all I have for today. Next week, we'll be doing the top 10. We're going to be spending a lot more time on those guys, especially when we get to the top 5. I have some special plans. As always, I appreciate your guys' support, and we'll see you in a couple of days.